Consider supporting Archaeosoup on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description. Thank you.
Questions of Doom.
Hello, and welcome back to another
Questions of Doom.
As ever in this series, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but as you'll also see at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my fond hope that the answer is not only useful to the person who's asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Now, today's question of doom is quite lengthy and quite detailed, but it's also an excellent question, and it goes as follows. Hello! First of all, as a fan of history and archaeology, I'm so glad I stumbled upon your channel on YouTube. It's interesting to watch, and I'm sure I'm going to have lots of fun watching all previous and upcoming videos on the channel. Great job. Well, thank you very much. I have a question related to common people, or lay people, I suppose, using metal detectors to search for artifacts or items of the past. Do historians and archaeologists consider this a pest or a blessing? I live in Flanders, Belgium, which has been a battlefield in many wars, and I suppose it won't be a surprise that I'm intrigued by so many gripping events and stories of World War I and World War II. There are several channels on YouTube where people search all over Europe for military artifacts of those wars using metal detectors, and although I'm watching these with great fascination and interest, it also troubles me that they may actually be destroying history instead of revealing it. One unearthed bullet, where once thousands were fired, arguably won't make a difference, one might say. Dog tags, remains of the fallen, and live ammo needs to be registered. And these wars are very well documented. Yet, what if the remains of a found plane were actually significant, but are now resting in a private collection without anyone knowing? What if a serial number in a found mechanical part would let a military historian know that some platoon he or she is researching was involved in this or that skirmish? Or, as I've inserted, what if that sort of information allowed individuals to be traced? So maybe a family can trace their loved one or their great-great-grandfather or something through the war based on the equipment that they were associated with. So actually there's also individual potential and personal interests here as well. How about museums that desperately try to preserve a tank but can't find parts? While I have seen videos where tanks are just rotting away in some forest, ignored by metal detecting diggers because it's too heavy to take. And I'm not even talking about the situations that might be more like grave robbing, looting and greed. Not everyone is interested in the story behind the objects. To some, it's just about finding the object itself and the thrill that comes with it. That's an interesting point. Of course, my question is not only related to the World Wars, and my concerns become more clear when it comes to objects of a distant past, simply because these things are even more rare to find. And while it's fascinating to watch documentaries about some Anglo-Saxon treasure, or episodes of Time Team digging up Roman artifacts thanks to the finds of an amateur using a metal detector, and presumably guiding or flagging the field for a local archaeologist and in turn, for example, Time Team to turn up, I wonder how much information is lost. Even if an amateur comes forward with his findings, the context that the object was found in is lost. Well, not always, but we'll come to that. And like I said, this is if an amateur comes forward. Or maybe there is no reason to worry about it, as it could mean that even more things are found, and we have even more information about the past than when only archaeologists would dig the earth. Although I have to say, I don't think there has ever been a time when only archaeologists were digging up ancient artifacts. But again, we'll probably come back to that. I don't know, he says. I do know there is no right, wrong, or simple answer to my question, but I'm very interested in the opinion of archaeologists, historians, or people who are professionally involved in this. Many regards and thank you, John de Rock. P.S. My apologies for any writing errors or grammar issues. English isn't my main language. Well, John, your English is much better than my French, and you've managed to ask a very detailed question there, which does boil down to this question of, do historians and archaeologists consider this to be a pest or a blessing? But I'll try and touch on some of your particular case studies and ideas in my answer. So first of all, it's worthwhile saying that you're not alone in supposing that there is a sort of a race going on. A race to the stuff, to the treasure, indeed, between archaeologists and metal detectorists, and that somehow actually metal detectorists and people who have a weekend or even actually in some cases an actual business, a hobby perhaps, or a business revolving around the use of metal detection devices to recover artifacts and maybe sell them or keep them in collections, that these people are necessarily the boogeymen, as it were, of archaeology, that they are always bad actors. That's not necessarily the case. There are good metal detectorists and there are also bad archaeologists. We shouldn't pretend that archaeologists are saints and that we've all taken vows to never profit directly from material that's recovered from the ground. So just as in a unit, you may well find a metal detectorist who works quite regularly with, for example, Wessex or something like that, an archaeological unit that often what they'll be doing is sort of metal detecting the spoil, so the soil coming out of an excavation, to try and find things that have been missed perhaps by the people who are doing the digging. You'll also find sometimes archaeologists who have got into trouble frankly for fleecing artifacts, or for example for planting artifacts, for dealing with maybe a metal detectorist who discovers an object and then hands it off to the archaeologist who will plant it in order to set up some sort of personal fame, some sort of discovery that they can brag about. These things have happened, and we shouldn't pretend that there is a simple line between a good archaeologist and a bad metal detector. But there are tendencies, and more often than not, archaeologists will have a tendency to be much more concerned with the story, whereas metal detectorists will be much more concerned with the artifact. So, as you touched on in your question, this idea that not everyone is interested in the story behind the objects. To some, it's just about finding the object itself and the thrill that comes with it. Well, absolutely, you're more likely, I think, to find metal detectorists who are simply after that thrill. But that said, though, also there are lots of metal detectorists with a great amount of knowledge about what it is that they are detecting and what it is that they are likely to discover and recover. Often this knowledge is driven by a sense of what might it be worth, and therefore valuing the object on the fly and having a sense of what their haul is as they go. But that knowledge bank, that library, is also a very useful resource when these guys are working with archaeologists and working with, for example, the portable Antiquities scheme. So there's a great deal of there's a great resource there in the metal detecting community that we shouldn't alienate by characterizing them all as bad or potentially bad. Not that I think you were, but I just want to make sure that people understand I'm not. Now, I mentioned the portable Antiquities scheme. That's a scheme here in the UK, which has actually proven really rather successful over the past decade or so, in particular, in terms of allowing metal detectorists, and people who have access, and increasingly regular access, to metal detecting devices, to have a legitimate path by which artifacts can be monetized. They can make money from finding things by flagging where they found these things, what they found, and how they found them to local authorities. This allows the local archaeologists, the finds liaison officers, as well to create a map perhaps of what's in their jurisdiction. It allows museums to bid on those artifacts so that maybe they're not just sold into the ether and they end up in a private collection. Maybe actually they'll end up in the local museum. And crucially, it allows the metal detectorists to make money from that. And hopefully, therefore, heading off the temptation simply to go onto eBay or to find someone who is going to pay a lot more, a lot of money for an artifact, maybe even a lot more money for an artifact through other darker means, as it were. So we do have that in place, and this actually allows those people who aren't necessarily attached to archaeological units, but who do nonetheless go out and do often or will often find material to make money from that. Now, this isn't a guarantee that all of that information will come to archaeologists and historians, but it does mean that a lot more has been reported than otherwise would be. In some respects, the Portable Antiquities Scheme has highlighted how much information and knowledge would have been lost were it not for this legitimate route for these people to go into a field, find something, and therefore make money off it. It's as you say, it's this question of you do wonder about how much information is lost, and the PAS is a good estimate at how much information might have been lost if people had no opportunity to monetize that find. Now, this has been, unfortunately, this is often characterized by some people in particular, for example, in Italy, and also actually in France and parts of Belgium, as Britain encouraging looting and actually rewarding people for looting archaeological sites. And I would say that's not the case. That's not the case. What we're doing with the PAS and what's been shown to be the case is we're not encouraging more. What we're doing is we're encouraging those people who would do it anyway to report what they found and therefore also be able to benefit from what they found. If we didn't have that system in place, it's almost certain that this material would, like for example the Staffordshire Hoard, a wonderful Anglo-Saxon find, that would just disappear into the ether and we'd never know about it. So yeah, it's not a guarantee, but it is a way for, as I put in my notes here, it's a way for everyone to win, or to have the opportunity to win, if you see what I mean. Now, in the past, I've been very critical of some elements of the result of the community surrounding the metal detecting fraternity for encouraging a lack of best practice, and this is most particularly focused in recent years on a TV series called Nazi War Diggers. I think it's now called Battlefield Recovery on Netflix. They had to rebrand it because it was so distasteful. They also had to re-edit it as well to try and give themselves a bit more of an air of legitimacy. But in Nazi War Diggers, just in the trailers that were released at the time, a few years ago now, it was clear that there was no best practice. And as you say, there was this element of people choosing what they were finding because of how takeawayable that material was. In what we know of how that series was made and filmed, there was no set excavation techniques. Recording was minimal. The safety in terms of handling of ammo was not necessarily evident in the footage, no matter what the subtitles that they put on the screen or the overlay said after the fact, after the editing process. And also as well, in terms of motivation, there was a stated motivation of recovering, battlefield recovery, recovering stuff from battlefields and handing it over to museums. But actually there's very little evidence that this material ends up in a legitimate sense in a museum, with a context and actually in a way that's actually serving the memories of the fallen. If this is actually the honourable intention of those actors, these people who are going out into the field and using these techniques to pluck material out of the ground, it's been really hard actually to show that and actually to demonstrate that. And in fact, in recent days, in recent weeks, I'm not going to use any names, but some people linked with that show have been shown to be just selling material. They're turning up at certain events and just selling material of indeterminate origin. So that's actually a big strike against the as it were, the culture surrounding metal detectorists, and it only gets worse when you really start to look at how this culture propagates itself. It does set itself up in opposition to archaeology and to in that sense historians. Gatherings where you can pay maybe 10, 15, 50 quid or something to turn up in a field and sweep the whole place, where the metal detectorists will come together. Maybe there's a burger van, there's some folk music going on as well. They'll turn it into an event. These actively discourage finds liaison officers turning up. They don't want any risk of what they find falling into a legitimate, say, the portable antiquity scheme. They are in that sense simply looking for the thrill of the discovery, and also arguably to sell it on. This also happens in YouTube channels, and I know some of the channels that you're referring to where they'll tacitly give sort of hints at where they might be, but they won't show landmarks, they won't show the sky, for example, or other elements that might allow you to sort of hone in on where it is that they're doing their digging. Sometimes this is because they're wanting to protect the integrity of their find spot, but also as well sometimes it's basically so the law and landowners even can't track them down. It's not a healthy community, I suppose, is what I'm getting at. And this is also reflected in the fact that often metal detectors are sold as treasure hunting machines, treasure hunters. I've seen them, literally that's what they're called on the box, you know. And so while I began this answer saying that actually we shouldn't characterize metal detectorists and the metal detecting community as bad or as anti-archaeology, as somehow the negative image of actual archaeological best practice, they don't help themselves in some cases, and in some cases they literally are doing what I don't want to paint them all as doing, if you know what I mean. I don't believe that everyone with a metal detector is part of this sort of community and is actively trying to subvert the rules and hide their finds away from, for example, finds liaison officers. And incidentally, if someone's watching this who doubts that story, I've literally seen, for example, Facebook threads where people say, "Well, actually, I'm an FLO. Can I turn up at your event?" And they just get kicked out of the whole project, you know. So so this stuff does happen, and I suppose all of this comes back to this question of why, and also how can we maybe bring some of those people who are acting as boogeymen back into the fold, if you see what I mean. I suspect that part of the answer here lies in acknowledging at least two things. First of all, the fact that both archaeologists and metal detectorists are absolutely stuff obsessed. We're obsessed with finding things, and we're obsessed with, in the case of archaeologists, the stories that they tell. Also in the case of some metal detectorists, I'll be fascinated by maybe what a campaign button will reveal about a site, this kind of thing. So the story is part of it, but archaeologists normally then go a step further. We're interested in, as you say, context, and we're interested in taking that artifact through a process that will reveal more about the site where it was found. We're not interested, for the most part, in taking that object and hiding it, or owning it, or selling it, or actually obfuscating its origin so that people can't track us down and prosecute us for maybe being on someone's land illegally, or being maybe on the site of a war crime, for example, illegally, just so we can make a profit. We're not interested in doing that. But we are all stuff focused and stuff orientated, and so actually I come back to this idea of there being a bit of a race to the objects. Maybe what we need to do in that sense is acknowledge something else as well, and that is that we can't keep it all. Museums, archives, individual collectors, we need to try and find perhaps a balance. And a balance which discourages this sense of a race to stuff, and also a race in that sense to ownership. One of the things I always come back to is this question of who actually owns the past, and this is something which we'll be touching on hopefully in the not too distant future on this channel when it comes to, say, museums, in terms of, is a museum necessarily the best place for things to go? Is there another ownership model out there, one where maybe objects are tagged and well, not to say tagged, but they are flagged rather, sorry. They are recorded, perhaps digitally scanned, and then maybe actually let out into the community. Maybe we could have a situation where we could all have something interesting on our mantelpiece for a while, so long as we're willing to look after it, or say, to the best of our ability, and then it moves through the community. Perhaps that's a way of handling this, so that there isn't a sense of the metal detectorists must try and get the thing, get the boot-shaped bottle opener before the archaeologist gets hold of it, and rather actually what we end up doing is having a sort of a slightly looser sense of who owns the past, and we cut down these ideas of gatekeepers, because actually I don't consider myself to be a gatekeeper as an archaeologist. It's one of the reasons why I do this YouTube channel, is to share as much as I can. And the same goes for metal detectorists. Maybe we need to encourage them to relinquish some of their keys and some of their ownership of particular elements of the artifactual nature of the past. Now, I don't know if this is what you were getting at when you said an aeroplane ending up in someone's private collection. That's highly unlikely that a whole aeroplane might end up in someone's shed, for example. But I know what you mean in terms of people rushing to take things, maybe parts of aeroplanes, the propeller, the wheels, instrumentation from the cockpits. I know that these things are valuable to collectors. And this idea of hiding those objects and making them essentially invisible, but also useless in terms of storytelling and the public access to the stories that they can tell, is a key issue. And I suspect that we can start to tackle some of these issues by, as I say, acknowledging that first of all, we're all interested in the stuff. Stuff is the touchstone to the past, and whether you're an archaeologist or a metal detectorist, you will have a fascination with stuff. But also, secondly, what is the ultimate destination of that stuff? And how can we best find a balance between access, feeding a passion, no matter why you're digging up stuff, but feeding that passion, and ultimately an acknowledgement that this material will end up somewhere. And the fact that actually we can't, for example, continue to fill up archives forever. We also can't necessarily condone private collectors keeping stuff private, because ultimately, when it comes to ownership, I think ultimately the past belongs to everyone. It doesn't belong to archaeologists, it doesn't belong to historians, it doesn't belong to metal detectorists. It belongs to us all. Even someone who's an IT specialist, they may not do anything really linked with history and archaeology, but they have a right to know about it, and they have a right to have access to that knowledge and information. And that's really ultimately where I sort of hopefully come sort of full circle and come back to this question of whether or not it's a blessing or a pest. I think it has the power to be both. The metal detecting community does in that sense have the power to be both, and I think it's all about the conversations that we have and the public understanding that we encourage as well about that relationship between them and their past as much as anything else. Don't just leave it to metal detectorists to decide what they do, and also don't just leave it to archaeologists. We should all be talking about this stuff and all be thinking about it. So hopefully that's been a useful answer to your question. And hopefully you guys who are watching this at home and elsewhere have found this interesting and useful as well. Please do comment below if you want to add to this discussion. And I know that this particular topic can spark passions, especially from the metal detecting community, who sometimes feel that they are being characterized as bad actors or as people who are wrong. That's not been my intent. My intent has been to actually to look at all of these different issues. But if there's anything that you want to comment on below, keep the comments civil, keep them productive, and hopefully we'll all come away from this question with a more rounded understanding of the issues in play. As ever, guys, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.